Good afternoon or morning, everyone. My name is Meg Sattler and I am the Director of Ground Truth Solutions. And it is my great honour and also my surprise to be here with you today. I'm actually filling in for Rosie Jackson, who was to be facilitating this session, but at the last minute got called into a medical emergency with her family. Everyone's fine. But I have agreed to step in just a few minutes ago. So great to be here. As you know, possibly, Ground Truth Solutions is a member of the CDAC Network. So it's great for us to participate in this session on the theme of disruption, which is certainly a very welcome topic for anyone who works on this space in accountability and community engagement. CDAC certainly supports and encourages reflection on whether or not we are significantly disrupting and driving change, as does Ground Truth Solutions. And CDAC is, for those who are not familiar, a global network that's focused on shifting the dial on decision making, looking at communication as a conduit for seeding power and allowing global conversations to be driven by progression and solution finding at a context level. We see meaningful engagement as a non-negotiable in the directing of resources, as well as really the only route through which appropriate decisions can be made by involving people who need to be in those decisions. The CDAC network was set up in 2009 and today contains 35 members spanning the UN, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, NGOs, media organisation and other specialist entities. Focusing on embedding communication, community engagement and accountability in humanitarian action. The CDAC network has entered a new strategy period, and as we double down on the vision of the network and have spent the years sort of exploring digital communication and accountability, we've really been thinking, how can technology offer this tipping point in shifting the power, or indeed can it? And as with this discussion, we've been considering technology and the extent to which significant disruptions such as the pandemic have given rise to new learning over the last 18 months. This discussion began in April and May with a degree of optimism, I guess, that the change required to manage a pandemic may have changed the dynamics in aid and delivery. I think as we continued to discuss, we sort of answered no to our own question of whether technology has been this tipping point. And so we wanted to sort of use that as the starting point for the discussion today and see whether more creativity is needed in coming to some of the solutions that we need. We as a network certainly crave disruption and we stand behind the people and communities who are the critical drivers of the change that needs to happen. So today we ask the question, why are digital technologies not transforming accountability in aid? This session is on the role of digital technology in managing and leading disruption during the meeting. And if you're interested in this theme, please do check the agenda for other sessions within the series. Just quickly before I introduce our very wonderful panel, a little bit of housekeeping that I need to go through. So for Zoom, the window works just like a regular Zoom call, so you'll be muted by default. There's a chat option, so please use the chat on the right-hand side to comment during the session. We will be using your comments to nudge us along, so please don't be shy, please get involved, challenge us, challenge the panel, continue to ask questions. You can also ask questions via the questions and polls section in Slido. Where you will be able to upvote other questions. And towards the end of the session, we'll be running a poll to gauge your thoughts on a particular question to help us draw some conclusions towards the end. So without much further ado, I'm pleased to say that we are joined by some experts in the field. And together we will reflect on some of the conversations that have been happening under the CDAC network umbrella for the last several months. Starting in alphabetical order, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Fernanda Baumhardt, who is an advisor on accountability to affected people and community engagement in the OCHA Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. She's been working in communication since 1996 for the first 9 years with the mainstream media like Bloomberg and CNN, until she left the Hollywood life for a more meaningful approach to try and help the planet. And since then, she's worked with IOM, IFRC, UN Women, WFP, CashCap, OCHA, working on community engagement and accountability. So she'll be quite familiar to some of you. Fernanda started her own participatory communications organisation in Brazil, and that's trained over 500 young people in Rio, and has subsequently been training communities and people affected by crises in over 25 countries. We also have Hill Francis Arevalo, who is the specialist and coordinator for UNICEF, currently based in Tajikistan. You may have seen Hill around the traps. I've certainly worked with him quite a lot in recent years. He has 12 years experience in media, communication, humanitarian response, community engagement, and since 2003 has worked in various organisations across the Asia Pacific and the Central Asia region, including UNICEF, OCHA, UNDP, UNFPA, I think every UN acronym there, Save the Children, and also the YMCA. He led the creation of the first community of practice on community engagement and accountability in the Philippines, and then supported the same in Indonesia, and is certainly an expert voice on everything accountability related. And last but not least, we have Jim Fruchterman, who is the founder of Tech Matters. Jim is a leading social entrepreneur, founder of Benetech and Tech Matters, which are non-profit tech companies based in the Silicon Valley. He spent the last 30 years developing large-scale change in partnership with hundreds of organisations as part of social enterprises addressing education, disability, human rights, and also the environment. He is also a former rocket engineer, which he may be the only person on this panel who can claim that, who has founded 2 successful for-profit high-tech companies and received a number of awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship and the Scholar Award for Social Entrepreneurship. So no shortage of expertise, and I'm looking forward to diving into the questions. And I want to start first of all with the theme, which is sort of familiar to the humanitarian space, which is, are we fixated on technology failing? In some of the discussions for the CDAC strategy, we have focused on this topic in great detail. We've considered peer-to-peer communication and how the pandemic has given rise to local solutions to communication that sort of sit outside the humanitarian sector. We've spent time discussing social media, rights, inequity, access, and the distribution of digital technology. You could say perhaps that we've spent the year in the weeds on a topic like this. But today we want to challenge ourselves and sort of challenge the humanitarian dialogue to see if we can move this topic on. So sort of forgive us as we mount an attack on our own system. They say great change happens in times of discomfort, so here goes. I should say also at this point, we will refer often to humanitarian actors. I think within the CDAC network, we consider humanitarian actors to be a very broad and encompassing term. But for the purpose of most of this conversation, if we consider humanitarians to be those of us who hold power in decision-making, also around technology investment, resourcing, national, international, for-profit, not-profit, etc. I want to sort of start with Hill as someone who has worked in very tech-heavy communities, I suppose, on community engagement. Do you think it's a valid argument that technology doesn't work for communication and community engagement? And do you think the risks outweigh the gains? Or do you think, in a way, humanitarians are sort of stuck in the past and just don't really know what to do when it comes to technology?
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, thanks, Max, for the question. You know, I'm torn between being hopeful and critical at the same time. Hopeful because, you know, I've been involved, you know, not only in developing some startups in terms of technology, and at the same time, you know, mainstreaming this across both for minimum preparedness and response action. But I am also critical because most of the time we keep missing the mark. and we keep missing, the what you call this great opportunities to make those technologies or platforms more impactful, at the same time accountable. And it all boils down, over the last decade of being involved in this, I would say that it all boils down to some the usual fundamental components. Number one is that we humanitarians, as you said, in the broader terms, we are not that sensitive or cautious about the overall digital literacy and the digital inequities. And this is crucial because we are dealing with the different kind of emergencies in urban and in rural areas. And most of the time, if you look at Asia Pacific and Central Asian region, most of those people who don't have access to these digital platforms are those from the rural areas. And those people as well with limited educational attainment. The other component is that as a humanitarian, we keep on falling short about understanding the social behavioral components, not only of accessing, but at the same time of trusting these platforms and technologies. Because from my experience in Asia Pacific context, both in preparedness and response, it takes time for people not only to appreciate, get used to it, but more importantly, to trust or even make the platforms their preferred choice. So we need to, it doesn't happen overnight for people to accept a certain platform or digital technology for them to make it as the preferred channel. The other component is that we keep on making the same mistakes about missing, the interdependent connections of innovations to localization and localizations to inclusions and inclusions to policy platforms and policy platforms to the minimum preparedness actions. One example I can give there is that, the success of, I think we were familiar about this with Meg as well, the success of the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter is one example where it enables to be embedded in all these, components I've mentioned, talking about policy platforms. So other countries now adopted some national platform or policy to use, like to mandate each telcos to provide the necessary, I would say, messages for people as part of early warning. And at the same time, if there will be humanitarian crisis, people can access these services like free SMS, free calls, and even the free Wi-Fi to the ears. And at the same time, it is being backed up by the policies and at the same time by other tech companies. So what I'm saying here is that there's always a challenge for us humanitarian and the tech companies about the fear to be regulated, the fear to be mandated, and also to look at these agents about the fear of losing one's visibility the moment everything becomes more inclusive or I would say collective. And probably my last point would be is that we humanitarians, as much as we as want to project ourselves that we evolved through the last decade, we humanitarians are still reacting. We want quick, fast, and predictable approach in everything we do. We don't invest so much on preparedness. When I say preparedness, this is a time where you need enough prepositioning of partnerships, enough prepositioning of this platform, and you need to keep on testing this for these platforms to evolve. So yeah, in a nutshell, I would say that I'm hopeful about the potential of this technology because I've seen we've made progress, at the minimum, I would say we've made progress on this. There's no denial of that. However, as long as we're not going to deal with this criticality about, how components of affected communities to engage more on this, then more likely we're going, to do the same thing. Over to you.
Thank you, Helen. As you were talking, I could see Jim nodding and smiling, so I'm going to direct my next question to him. As sort of looking at this fear of losing visibility or fear of failure, do you think, Jim, that, looking into this system, are humanitarians sort of fixating on this? And is there any part of this where technologists are sort of contributing to a problem, potentially by overpromising or by sort of engaging in a way that's not that productive? So over to you, Jim.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, humanitarians aren't wrong when they think, gee, technology is generally terrible. and how do technologists participate in building lots of terrible technology? Well, they go along with the latest fad, right? So let's do a blockchain. Let's do an app that no one will download. Let's build a giant database in the sky that no one will look at. I have like a list of the bad ideas that everyone builds over and over again, and they almost never work, right? And so, but technologists are like, sure, pay me. I'll build it. Tell me the spec. And the fact is that that's actually not how technology in the rest of society actually worked. It used to be that way, right? Every organization used to build its own custom solution, right? That was the norm in business 30 years ago. But now, if you were running a restaurant, do you want a blockchain in your restaurant? Do you want AI in your restaurant? No, you want, the bills to be paid and the orders to show up on time. I mean, you want plumbing. You want plumbing that works reliably. And that's just not how we approach technology in the nonprofit sector generally and the humanitarian sector specifically, right? And Hill's point about getting prepared. I mean, yeah, sure, let's build a new solution for this disaster. I mean, that's like, why would anyone in their right mind expect it to work? So I think if you actually look at sort of modern practice, if I was starting a for-profit tech company instead of the nonprofit ones that I prefer, because I'd rather work on things like the people on here that mean more and maybe make less money. But if you're really going to focus on that, you should sit back and go, let's engage the user community, right? And often in the nonprofit sector, humanitarian sector, that translates as the humanitarian staff workers and not the people in the communities that we're serving. So, but let's include both sides of that equation. Let's actually find out what they're doing today, what's working for them, what's not working for them. Let's get the stories of how technology could really, really help. And let's build that, and let's do that not for a single organization, reinventing the wheel over and over again, but let's get together with our competitors, our collaborators in this and say, hey, other industries get together around common tech plumbing and common applications and focus. That's the way technology gets built very well today, so that every organization isn't the only person paying for the functionality, which always means that you're 10 years behind the time. But I do a lot of sort of karmic consulting for nonprofit CEOs on technology. And my number one job is anti-consulting. I don't care what your board member told you. I don't care what McKinsey told you. I don't care what your technologist probably told you. That's probably not going to work. What are you really trying to do? Hey, here's an example of another social action group that solved a similar problem. Why don't you learn that? Or here are 5 people who failed at doing exactly what you're talking about doing. Why don't you look at why they failed and at least make a new mistake? So this is, but humans sort of react to the incentives they find. So if the UN issues an RFP that says they want blockchain proposals, which I've responded to some of those, you're going to get blockchain proposals, even if they're stupid.
I'm gonna end on your even if they're stupid comment, because I think it's an important reality check, I think, for all of us about how, and the way that you frame it like that is so true. It's completely absurd that in this sector we think we're somehow above just using solutions that have already been tested and are already being used by people who we're working with. Instead we feel like we need to invent all of these new ones. And I've certainly worked on a lot of processes or been in organizations that have been working on processes like the blockchain, or we need to invent our own credit card system so people can use credit cards. Similarly, I think when you talk about the users and you're talking about the user community, the communities that we are trying to engage with, it's the same. So often, instead of looking at, what technologies are people already using in a certain place, which is, I know, the sort of basis underpinning a lot of the work that Hill has done, we end up sort of then, particularly in some of the big agencies, which will remain unnamed, but trying to create new ones, like what's a system we can create for engaging with communities in X number of places. I think this is a good segue to bring Fernanda into the discussion, because I know that, a lot of your work sort of does start from this community perspective and sort of work its way up. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, are we painting too bleak a view, and could we sort of be doing more to promote and learn from successes in technology, starting from that community level? Or do you feel like we're a bit of a lost cause in the humanitarian sector?
You know my answer, right, Meg? Okay, so a few questions for reflection. Are we designing with communities? Are we user-centered design? I don't think so. At least from what I have seen in my experience working mostly in Latin America, but also with some experience in Africa, I don't think so. And if we go back to what is our main goal, it's accountability. Okay, how do we impact accountability? There are many ways. If we make it simple, we're trying to involve communities to participate in the design of the response and in all phases of the program cycle, right? So then we come up with this apps or whatever solution that are not designed with, and we're trying to fix accountability. So I do have more questions than answers. I'll stop it now. Just maybe I'll come back later. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And yeah, you're right. I was not surprised by that answer. But it does sort of pose a question about, you know, maybe we're just looking at this the wrong way. And I do sort of, as alluded to before, I wouldn't mind sort of going back to Hill on this one, because I know that, you know, particularly in the Philippines, where you're working with such a connected society, you know, if there's an option to sort of better meet various communities where they are, can we see success happen? And so I want to sort of throw back to you, Hill. Do you think, you know, do you have any examples of where technology does sort of help us to increase accountability to affected people in a crisis?
Okay, I'll start first with the latest one that we did in the Philippines was, you know, when we introduced the use of the unmanned aerial vehicle, not only as part of doing this assessment, you know, with other agencies, but more importantly about capacitating the local government and together with the local community on how to use this. And at the same time, what are they going to generate? What they're going to expect when they use this unmanned aerial drone? So what we did was, instead of preparing them, you know, to conduct assessment in the likely, you know, possibility of like typhoon, earthquake, or any kind of emergency, what we did was a pre-crisis mapping as part of the minimum preparedness action. So we used the unmanned aerial technology, basically not to prepare them to ask that to do the assessment, but rather ask now, what are the preferred humanitarian aid or support that the at-risk community, the people in need or the affected population would likely be needing in the event of crisis. So we use the drone as part of the mapping, and we train them at some point on how to use. And there's also a transfer of the tool or the transfer of the platform to the pilot areas. So that's one example. The other one was when we negotiated with the telcos, as mentioned a while ago, Meg. I think I made mention about the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter, and in the Philippines, and now being adopted in Indonesia, and hopefully in Tajikistan, is that to adopt a national policy or put some positive pressure on telcos to go beyond the usual corporate social responsibility of providing these services of free calls, free SMS, or even free Wi-Fi in the likely event of humanitarian crisis. So we negotiated with them that somehow, you know, to invest on preparedness. Basically, you know, in preparedness, you provide this information or messages as part of early warning. Early warning for people to evacuate, you know, and with the end goal of achieving zero casualty. However, it does not stop there. If people are evacuated and now people are now staying in evacuation center, this is where the humanitarian component comes in. Meaning, if all communications breaks down, or all communication lines are down, it is the responsibility not only of the telcos, but the government agencies to ensure that the telcos are in pre-position to restore immediately the power lines and provide the services like free calls, free SMS. And now it has evolved by providing what we call free Wi-Fi, because people have used different apps. You know, right now you get the Telegram. Before it's only Viber and Messenger, but now you get the Telegram, you get the WhatsApp. So now they're maximizing these Wi-Fi services for people to communicate not only with their missing loved ones, but even to provide feedback on the ongoing response actions being provided by humanitarian agencies. So this particular component only happened because there was an investment, you know, there was a more proactive anticipatory action on the humanitarian, especially if you are in the Philippines, Indonesia, Nepal, or even Tajikistan. You get this opportunity to do this because on a regular or annual basis, you are responding to what we call, you know, small to medium scale emergencies like typhoons, earthquakes. So you got the the opportunity to, as mentioned by Jim, to test, fail, and somehow evolve in the use of technology. And you involve the community, and that's a good part of it. And I think the last one we use, and I think which is something that probably later on to discuss, is about the use of the Kobo tool. The use of the Kobo tool before is more of humanitarian tool in terms of using it for assessment. Now it has become a more localized tool, even for local agencies and for the community itself, at-risk community, with the use of the tablet, and can be used online and offline for use of of community engagement, like asking people the basic question. So yeah, that's all like example I can say, because for me, I think over the years, if we're going to unpack that, it doesn't happen overnight or within like 6 months of response. I'm talking about here years. In terms, when I say years, I'm talking about how many typhoons, how many earthquakes, how many other armed conflicts or displacement that happen for us, not only to perfect this, but somehow to play around and see what will happen and how it evolves in the process.
Thank you so much. And I think there's a bit of a common theme running through there about, alluding also to something Jim said about once humanitarians can let go of something, I feel like that's when you start to see a bit of success. So, instead of creating a platform, it's about how do we influence national policy, or, things that are sort of where you have to slink a bit more in the background, but in doing so, create this enabling environment. So there were some great examples. Thank you very much for those. We're going to pause now to take a look at a video from CDAC, where we will hear from a couple of speakers from the past year. We'll hear from Carolyn Viewman, who is the Chief Executive of Fondation Hirondelle, and Azad Hamidi, who is a refugee social media and activist.
What people need is information of service that will help them making decisions, and sometimes in some of the most difficult times of their lives, when they are facing a sanitary crisis or humanitarian crisis, security issues. And today, none of the platforms, the digital platforms, have a public interest mandate. They only have an economic and private profit mandate. So this is just impossible to have the needs of the people match the objective of these platforms. And for me, the inequalities Dr. Gaia raised is key, because throughout the time, people who have the technology and people who have the information have the power. It's not new. This is not new with the new technologies and digital means. It was the case with the books way back when, and then with the mass broadcasting capacities with radio and TV. And that factor of who has the technology, who owns the information, and thus has the power is not broken, because our societies are still pretty much built on that. And unfortunately, very often, male, educated, and already privileged people have the technology and the information. And as long as we don't break that dynamic, any technology we will actually perpetuate, and even in the case of the digital technology, reinforce that inequality.
To be honest with you, 5 years ago when I came to Europe, most of my friends didn't know something like Google exists. They didn't know they could ask things that they don't know. They can ask Google through it, or they can ask information through that, or the locations and stuff. But now it's completely changing, and it has nothing to do with the humanitarian sector, because the humanitarian organizations, they always try to provide information. The way they provided was they created their own Facebook page or a website, and they just uploaded information again and again and again. What they missed, the point was that the community cannot trust that information that's coming from the humanitarian sector. They trust more the information or the things they hear from their own community, and most of the time that's not face-to-face, because it's not possible for them to meet each other. So it's all digital.
A lot of food for thought there. And as I'm madly taking notes, I've realized I'm accidentally on brand using an ALNAP pen. So It's interesting because this theme of power, keeps arising more and more throughout this discussion. And throughout the CDAC network and beyond, there have been a lot of discussions this year, last year, about data and tech colonialism. And, in the way that tech is designed, used, and the way that we manage data in a humanitarian situation, there are a lot of sort of uncomfortable colonial echoes there. And that obviously raises some questions around, whose vantage point on technology is privileged and prioritised. There has been this enormous growth in sort of tools and technology to address community engagement and accountability. Many humanitarians are sort of in this privileged position to, think through how technology can help, even if it's not perfect. Assad joined us in our session on peer-to-peer communication and talks about his community's preference for imperfect solutions that were designed by and accessible to them. But often there's sort of this real privileging of, as we've spoken about already today, humanitarian-driven solutions. So a question, I think I'll throw to Fernanda first. This idea that, in humanitarian tech dialogue, that we're protecting, crisis-affected people from what humanitarians consider to be bad technology or bad data or sensitive data. There's a perception that there's sort of a we know best attitude. I'm sort of wondering, what are your reflections on that? Do you think that's correct? Or do you think that's a perception that's kind of getting in the way of solutions that could be quite useful?
I think it's important to discuss about data protection and the risks. But I think it's a bit arrogant to think that we need to protect. I think communities many times, and we cannot, and this is one of the part of the challenges, we cannot just speak generic, because as you know, Meg, you have so much experience, there are different contexts. There are contexts of conflict, there are contexts of natural disaster, earthquakes, there are different contexts. So we cannot speak about like one size fits all. So let me speak about what's going on in Latin America nowadays. One of the most challenges we have here is people on the move, right? People on the move. Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, internal displacement. They are looking for their own solutions, utilizing social media, utilizing connectivity, those who have it, to find the safest routes, for example. And so we are not part of this conversation. We can not necessarily let me just put, we're not necessarily part of this conversation, but we could be adding to this conversation, not imposing or taking this conversation towards a different route, but really like building on what's going on the ground, and then just offering solutions, but not creating things from scratch. So I don't know if I answered exactly what your question was, but yeah, some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think linked to that, as we've seen and as was discussed in the video, people in communities, like our own, like those affected by crisis, sort of develop and use digital technology that is imperfect all the time, with some degree of ease and comfort, depending on the community and the solution. And I guess a question to Hill, again, from your experience in this, do you think humanitarians are too reluctant to sort of lean into that or to adopt some of these technologies that aren't necessarily deemed to be perfect by decision makers?
I would say not reluctance, but I would say, humanitarian community has the obsession, of pursuing a demand-driven, contextually tailored strategy to the point of missing the whole thing, like Are we doing a solution for high tech, low tech, or even no tech solution at all? That's the the crucial part that we keep on missing, because more likely, there's always the resource or capacities, but it's the lack of know-how on how really to use these resources or capacities. And we've seen that not only in the Philippines. We've seen a lot of apps, we've seen a lot of startups, we've seen a lot of hackathons, we've seen a lot of, a lot of these startups trying to please each agency, coming up with the new tech of the new platform. But the thing is, either we are so protective of the data we have, or the realization that the technology that we have is not that accountable enough to deal with feedback. And the other thing is the realization as well. It's not only perfect. We have to understand that the technology can malfunction. Technology can break down. And that's the basis for people to sow mistrust in the context. So I think it is incumbent for the humanitarian not only to be more cautious, but to recalibrate our approach, to see which of these platforms has an added value on the existing preferred or trusted channel of the people. It's not about reinventing the wheel, but trying to add value to the already existing. Like, for instance, we know for a fact that people use mobile phones, and that's their lifeline, if they want to speak with their missing relatives. But if you add internet Wi-Fi connection to that, in order for them to, to speak outside the community into the other country, to inform everyone, hey, I'm alive, I'm okay, everything's fine, that makes a difference. So for me, it's not only the reluctance, to use this, but it's more of not, we have so many resources, and we've seen that. And sometimes all these resources and capacity are all wasted. We try to hire a lot of consultants, a lot of people, dedicate staff to do this and that. And as to what? The crisis has, we read the timeline for humanitarian crisis from 3 to 6 months has elapsed, but you still have to develop the technology and apply it. It's good for preparedness, probably for the next cycle of emergency, but you're missing the opportunity. You miss the mark.
I saw that your obsession comment garnered a heart response from Fernanda. So good to see that resonated. And it is interesting, isn't it, that, as humanitarians, we're definitely not always even expert in humanitarian response, as we see time and again from feedback from communities, and yet somehow we feel like we're now experts in technology and how and when to deploy it, which is again sort of absurd when you actually take the time to think about it. I see in my notes here that, Jim, you've said before that humanitarians are 15 years behind when it comes to technology, and that we're kind of dinosaurs who always live in the past. I wondered whether you had anything to say to sort of elaborate on that in light of what we've just heard.
Well, I think you've heard some real through lines, right? Fernanda's point about, are we developing technology with people or for them? And the habit is for, right? And when you're collecting data or designing technology, people watch what you do, right? And so if they tell you your technology is broken, I don't want to use it, and a year later, it's the same broken technology, they get the idea that talking to you about your broken technology is a useless exercise, and they'll stop talking to you. Or if the incentives in data collection are, if you give us this data that says this, you'll get the services and the needs that your family needs, people will lie to you in order to get what they deserve, right? What they feel they deserve, right? Because people are very sophisticated about these incentives. And and then I mean, I think Caroline talked about power, right? The modern technology allows people to give a lot of power to the communities that we serve, right? What if you give them the power to tell you that your programmatic objectives were all wrong and that you have to pivot, right? Every tech company that starts up is ready to go away from what they thought the users wanted to what the users actually want, because that's the way to make money. But our structures don't often allow that, right? I mean, if we got money from, a big UN agency or USAID, going back to them and telling them, yeah, your RFP was all wrong and our program design was all wrong, we want to do this other thing. This doesn't actually happen very often in the real world, unless, now I know that there's a through line of people who have figured out how to work with the system and actually do human-centered design and actually be more agile and actually, solve the problem. But it requires sort of like like how do you work inside these structures and strategies, that envision 3 to 5 year funding cycles. I mean, in technology, the technology we're using in 5 years does not resemble the technology we're using today very well. And so it's a very interesting dynamic. And I think that if you really want to use technology to be accountable, to actually listen to the communities, to serve them better, you have to give them the power to actually influence what you do. And a lot of the time, what they do isn't what you wanted them to do, right? We're not here to tell them what they should want or what they should do. We're here to give them better information, better tools, maybe even money, to make the decisions that they think are best. And that involves a complete shift in the way we think about our work. That shift is going on, and there are some bright spots, but by and large, the monoliths are continuing to roll down the old tracks.
Yeah, a lot of that resonates. I mean, obviously at Ground Truth, we find out almost every day that, if the sector is not listening to its, end users, I suppose. And because decisions are not being driven in that way, and we are sort of tied to these, calls for proposals and designing projects that fundamentally haven't been designed off the back of people's preferences, and then sort of trying to bring them in at a stage where it's too late, and then just ending up with a lot of, dissatisfied people on the sort of receiving end of humanitarian aid. It seems like a daunting challenge to think how we can, get that right from a tech perspective, where you're sort of adding another element of complexity. But I have another question for you sort of on that, where in terms of sort of technical experimentation, you often see multiple failures before you get something right. And humanitarian work, for whatever reason, is still quite donor driven. We still sort of really want to demonstrate success, and the way that success is determined is still, I would argue, from a very supply driven perspective. And it sort of seems like, this tension means that we only reach a partial success, and we could probably learn a bit more from experimentation in the tech world about how to actually involve users more and sort of work on something that ultimately has more impact. And I'm just wondering if you've given much thought to how we can sort of move beyond this in the humanitarian sector when it comes to bringing solutions and technology closer together.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, my dream scenario, and this is actually how we work, is that a great social sector leader brings together her competitors and peers, and so far, last few years, it's all been women leaders, and they actually get together, and I mean, so like, for example, we have a big project with UNDP and a bunch of the big conservation NGOs, right? And these people compete for money all the time, but if they get together and say, hey, we're terrible at technology. I mean, they don't say that out loud, but it's kind of true. It's they kind of get it. And we need a reform movement because we're not getting to our goals, right? We're not getting to the SDGs. We're not getting to, Paris. If they come together and say, we want technology that's going to shift power to this community, and we're going to work together on it. That's my ideal solution as a technologist. That creates a window of opportunity where, we can build technology that might touch 10 million or more people, might reach 1,000 organizations. That's a product, that's an enterprise. Now it may be open source and all that, but it's when a field of practice comes together and says, we're going to set aside our desire to reinvent the project that our big competitor did because of donor reasons, and instead say, what is it going to take us to actually accomplish this new wave of reform? Because the technology doesn't do reform. The technology supports reform. There has to be some ideas that have come from the field of what's going to work better in the next sort of phase. And it could be the technology will allow you to be 3 or 5 times more effective if you implement this new reform. Now, along that path, I think, Meg, to your point, we will release software every 2 months for a period of 5+ years, right? It's going to keep getting better because we learned that doesn't work. Well, let's stop doing that. Let's work on this other thing. And when people see that the software is getting better every couple of months, they keep giving you feedback, and you watch what people actually do instead of what you think they should do, and you actually pay attention to that. So I think this new approach is starting to pop up in a lot of different segments, right? Where, we've seen some good projects in, especially in public health, right? Because public health has developed a lot of these joint efforts because, frankly, you don't need to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And everyone is using, to collect data, they may be using Kobo Toolbox. Why? Because, it makes a lot more sense to have a working platform that is 80% enough and then use it rather than try to reinvent it. Well, when you reinvent something, it fails the majority of the time. So, and then your money's gone and you're done. So anyway, so I think that joint effort for a technologist is where things really happen. And when you get the buy-in from the big organizations that they actually endorse a power shift to the grassroots organizations, the indigenous communities, to the farmers, to the, whoever it might be, that is where it might work. And I'm looking for those kinds of things.
You referenced Kobo again there, which was something that Hill had mentioned. And I think, the success of that, where people sort of come together around something that makes sense, has been, well flagged in this chat. And so I want to throw it back to Hill again. And sorry to put you on the spot about another example, but I'm sort of wondering, off the back of Jim's remarks and off something like, how Kobo was sort of adopted, and this idea that you can sort of bring people together around something that makes sense, and there's different stakeholders who could sort of be brought into that. I'm wondering if there are sort of more examples, or you could elaborate a little bit on how that happened on some of the common platforms that you've worked on, and if there's any sort of common sense takeaways that we could generate from that.
I'll start with the word collective. The famous jargons, collective and interagency. Yeah, going back to that, I think the success of Kobo tool can be attributed as well to the success of the way we not only experimented, but the way we piloted the use of, like, as I've said, the use of drone, the way we mainstream the use of this, or supporting the telcos and the government about using this, under the components of digital humanitarian connectivity. Plus the fact that, at the time, there was already the call that you need to be more proactive. So more investment, I would say more investment, at least the realization for humanitarians not to be, the usual reactive kind of approach in terms of engaging the communities. There was that kind of, environment. So I think it all boils down to that, because as I've said, for instance, it took us like how many, probably within the span of 6 months, and it took us like a painful experience as well. It took us like a while for people to understand the use of the drone. So we take it one at a time, one technology. Okay, this is the use of the drone, and this is the way we managing expectations about the limitations of this technology. And then we started again using the use of the free calls, the free SMS, things like that. So little by little, step by step, we try to guide people in different contexts of emergence, talking about rural and urban, about the importance of this tool. Then we come to a point that probably we also need to engage them in a more meaningful and impactful manner, meaning let them do the assessment and let them do the engagement with their own peers. So this is where the Kobo tool comes in. So the process there was, first, for them to be more familiar with the tool and what's the usage of this. So we started with the local government, and from the local government, they start to cascade with the local community. And then you provide them the tool, the training, and investment. And again, from 6 months, it became like a 2-year project, So I'm telling you now, so the success of the Kobo tool took 2 years, 5 earthquakes, small, medium scale earthquakes, 7 typhoons. There's also flooding. At some point, there's also landslide in some parts of the north, and there's an armed conflict. And then there's the pandemic. Okay, so just to unpack, because you might see the tip of the iceberg, but not really, the experience and the process where I became successful. So in the process, people became familiar with it. We keep on testing it. Okay, let's use this, for instance, in the context of assessment. Then we come to realize probably what we can do is to preposition this tool as part of the pre-crisis mapping. So with that, we keep on testing, we see the development, we monitor it. So 2 years, I would say at the minimum, we managed to to somehow influence and somehow mainstream it, within the system of the government, local government, and the acceptance of the local community.
It is interesting because you've described a process there where, I think people look at certain things and think, oh, that was, that happened very quickly, or, this is something great, we should roll that out in the next response. When actually looking at something that was like 2, 3, 5, 7 years in the making and probably still ongoing. And just a question to Fernanda on this, because I know that you also, are working in humanitarian settings, but have also had a lot of experience working on these longer term approaches and really sort of working with communities. And now, given your work with some of the kind of bigger UN agencies and things like that, what is it like to sort of try within those organisations to sort of make the case for this longer term perspective? And where do you think maybe focus needs to shift, whether it's within organisations or with donors, to convince humanitarians to sort of take this longer term view?
Okay, I don't believe it's about making the case. I think the case has been already made over and over again. And you actually are part of the case. Thank you so much, Meg and Ground Truth Solutions. There's enough of cases already. We're talking here about decision-making. We're talking here about leadership. We're talking here about cultural change. We're talking here about localization. We're talking here about old school versus new school. We're talking here about fear of the uncontrolled, of not, I don't want to give my pen away to no one. We need to dive deeper into those elements and stop just looking obsessively for developing better tools. We have beautiful dashboards already. How many dashboards do we have? The question is, how much of those dashboards are really into the humanitarian country teams? That's the question. And I'll give you a better example. In Colombia, we have OCHA, which is the organization that is also present in Uganda. They have been collecting voices as Ground Truth Solutions as well. And they have collected 15,000 voices from different places in Colombia in the past 1 year. And the voices have been saying the 3 top priorities: we need work, we need to set up our business, we don't want to be assisted, we want to assist our own self. What are we doing about that? That's the question I have it, for many people. So yeah, over.
It's a great reminder, and I think we come across this so much also at Ground Truth. We're sort of called upon to continually make the case or to produce more data. And on dashboards, I had to laugh when you said that, because so often we're presented with dashboards as a solution. The country team is addressing accountability because they're making a dashboard. And it just feels like, we're all sort of discussing and collecting, and there is this whole action gap, which, before I veer off onto a very impassioned tangent about that, I'll pause proceedings for a minute, because I think we have another video. So we'll hear now from 3 more perspectives from some of the CDAC discussions this year.
I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really propelled us into a world, whether we live in cities or villages, where we are using tech much more, and not just, internet, social media and other forms of tech. But I think the biggest lesson, particularly in the last couple of years with COVID-19, is that the access to technology has been really impacted by inequities that exist. So rich and poor, where you are geographically, whether you're a man or a woman. I mean, for example, we know that in any country, rich or poor, women tend to have lower access to the internet. In Africa, the difference is about 13%. So only about 20% of women in Africa, 1 in 5, have access to internet, where it's 33% for men. So I think we're really seeing existing inequities impacting on how we harness the, if you like, the benefits and the magic of technology.
Development is very much meaningful when it involves the people for whom interventions are being led. The belief and conviction is that community people should initiate their own interventions, lead them, participate in them, and actually be the ones at the forefront of it. So the question to ask then would be, this conversation we are having about how not to leave the vulnerable people behind in terms of the conversations. Why are we, for example, not really directly engaging with those people? Why are we not picking the voices from the communities and all of that? And I believe we all do know the answers to these. And essentially, it is because, first of all, these communities that are affected by the issues that we talk about every day, in the first place, may not have access to technology. Well, in some communities, they may have access to technology, but would lack the skills to be able to connect and engage. And even where they have access and they have the skills, they may not have the resources to be able to afford the high cost of data in many parts of the world, particularly in this part of the world, in Africa. And even where in cases, they have access, they have the skills, and they can afford, there is the issue about the language and how can they engage. So in a particular community in Ghana, for example, yes, a certain person in the rural area, first of all, may have internet access, may have the skills to connect, can afford the data, but the person cannot speak English. And here we are having this beautiful and brilliant conversation in English.
The most radical and the most powerful data is often the data we don't want to hear about. It's the bad news, right? It's when through feedback channels you're hearing that people aren't receiving what they need to receive, or they're receiving at the wrong time, or actually it's completely different from what they would most want to receive. There is no incentive in the system to share that information. That information gets buried. At best, that information will be used to reshape a specific program in a specific area. But it won't go outside that program. It won't go to management of that organization. And it certainly won't go across the response to other organizations and other communities. And that's where the learning happens.
More food for thought. I'm struck by a question that I wanted to ask Jim. Which is, we heard a lot more in that video again about, kind of meeting people where they are. We've spoken a lot about, using existing technologies. And it does sort of beg the question, I guess, how do we feel then about some of these technologies that are meeting people where they are, but that come with certain loaded reputations, for example, your Facebooks or your Googles. In this sector, do you feel, Jim, that they're kind of friends or foes? And how can we work better within these big giants that already exist?
Well, they're both, right? And the relative balance between the good and the bad varies by company, though I won't necessarily name individual companies. But, I'm based in Silicon Valley. I work a lot with the tech industry, right? And I'm a longtime campaigner for accessibility for people with disabilities, right? And right now I'm doing a lot of work for the crisis response field, right? So we're talking to the accessibility people inside these companies, and we're talking to the child safety or the global safety people at social media companies, right? These people they all care about the issue that we care about. They're just, relatively speaking, powerless inside their organizations, right? So good people in organizations, but compared to the business people who make these decisions, they're quite weak. And so I find myself in this frequent sort of position of advocating for regulation on these companies, while also working inside the companies to try to make the people who are, let's say, on the good side of some of these issues more powerful. And I rely, as an engineer who develops solutions, I rely on the activists out there screaming at the top of their lungs about the worst excesses in how these companies do that, do these things. And these are huge issues. And I think as an American, I greatly admire the European approach to regulating privacy and hopefully soon regulating AI and machine learning. Thank goodness somebody is taking a leadership position for countering the excesses of my community. And the last thing is, like, very few tech people went into a tech company to do evil. And so now a lot of them are struggling with the fact that, well, maybe I didn't intend, but I certainly seem to be part of this thing that is causing, great damage to children, or is a font of misinformation. And why? Because it makes us more money. So it's a very interesting dynamic. And I know that part of being from the humanitarian sector is to keep spotlighting when it works well and when these companies are good. Like to Hill's point, when can we get them to voluntarily give zero-rated services when society needs it, rather than being forced by the telecoms regulatory agency to zero rate, I don't know, the child helpline or the gender-based violence line, because companies by and large don't do these things unless they're sort of embarrassed into doing it, or they have some amazing leader who is willing to break with the sort of the institutional tendency of companies like them.
And this kind of awkward relationship that we have with these big companies, I know you've spoken also on how people are so afraid of these big tech giants that they carry around all their data in their laptops and they don't trust anything sort of cloud-based. How do you see that being sort of a problem in our sector, and some of the things that we might think about doing to overcome that?
I mean, there's a lot of fear. We've talked a lot about fear, right? And so because of fear, people think carrying around unsecured data on their laptops is safer than having it in a cloud lockbox that has 200 safety engineers and security engineers fighting off the hackers, right? But and how do we get there? Well, one thing, when we build custom solutions one-off, the security is terrible, right? You would not, I have seen an NGO show me a map where you could zoom in at a household level and see who answered the domestic violence question yes. A public map on the internet where I could actually see household data. And I said, I could go and I could fly to that, to the Capitol, rent a car and an interpreter, drive to that house and ask that woman, so why did you answer the question about domestic violence? Yes. And they said, well, in theory. I'm like, no, in practice, right? So people often don't know. That's completely unethical, but that NGO had no idea that it was unethical because they didn't realize how sharp a scalpel we handed them, and they cut through their aorta and they didn't notice, right? Because it was that sharp. This is happening a lot. I've just replaced a tech system where people were sending the data of vulnerable children on an unsecured internet connection, right? Because some technologists built it badly and they didn't know that they built it badly. So this is why, even though hosting your data at Amazon Web Services, to pick a company that is not known for social responsibility by any stretch of the imagination, is safer because of all the equipment and all the infrastructure they do to safeguard your data. Where it's easy to turn on, multi-factor authentication for authorized users to, access sensitive data. But it takes a lot of effort to convince, social sector leaders that that's a safer place to put the data than on their own equipment or in a server in the closet. And that's a transition we're going through, and it involves a lot of education, but people, because of the lack of trust and the fear, people actually end up doing something that is much less responsible because they're afraid of the reputational risk of working with an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft or whoever it might be.
So if if we go from the big giants to back to the community level for a minute, because I guess we've sort of, if we assume then that, humanitarians are often using severely out of date technology, or we're using it incorrectly, or, we don't understand what we're doing with it. I know that there's a sense, and there's, evidence in a lot of places that communities are sort of bypassing humanitarian actors to use more up-to-date technology, whether that's for their own cash transfers or the way that they want to communicate, definitely the way they want to provide feedback, as I think we've all probably seen. Given some of your work, Fernanda, and again, sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering whether you have any examples of this, whether communities are sort of coming up with or using their own solutions that in a way completely bypass some of these humanitarian systems.
Well, I think I can go back to 2007 in Malawi, when I met the villagers of Mufunga near Salima district. And the Red Cross then was working with them to prepare for the climate change and why they needed to adapt their livelihoods, basically. So the Mufunga villagers, after learning that the climate was changing, they came up with a solution, which was forgetting about chickens and going to ducks, because ducks, they float during floods, and chicken, they die. So there you go. That was my first community-based climate change adaptation solution that I came across in 2007 in Malawi. And as such, there's plenty of solutions out there. But are we listening to the solutions? Are we harvesting? Are we flourishing? Are we inviting them in to tell us what they're doing? Or perhaps, maybe as the Red Cross then did, they discussed about climate change in very simple way, not scientific, complex, and then they triggered that creative power that lies in the community, because that is humanity. We are creative by nature. So I think it's, that was my learning then.
An excellent example. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, Hill, if you have any other examples of maybe not floating ducks and chickens, but anything from your work.
Yeah, probably I think like for instance in the pandemic, I think going back to one of the comments, and I forgot her name, I think it's Doctor something. I think she made mention about digital literacy and the digital inequities. And I think with the pandemic, actually, yes, that was the, there was the positive pressure for humanitarian agencies to maximize the use of these online platforms as much as possible in terms of the overall, the overall risk communication community component, because we thought that in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, all these online technologies could be the game changers. That was the, that was the mandate, that was the, the call for that. But we came to realize, that everyone's affected by the COVID-19, but it still goes back, to the impact between the urban versus rural. I'm talking about those geographically isolated, those far-flung areas where, oh my God, even at this point in time, they don't have access to all of these international, apps, applications, or platforms. They basically rely so much on information coming from the frontline workers, medical workers, or even from other authorities to provide information. So for me, I think what I can say all of this is that not only the fear or even the suspicion, the fear or the mistrust for this, but it's more actually on how we overestimate it, the probability of using these applications to engage the community. Again, it goes back again to, if it's in urban area, then basically you have the, at the minimum, you can basically maximize those platforms because people are so reliant and dependent that there's no denial on that kind of reality. But we're talking about rural. This is where we need to go, probably combining the low tech and even the no tech solutions at all. This is where we drew the line about us humanitarians engage in this platform. And of course, I think it boils down to the same discussion. Remember, again, the success of the Humanitarian Connectivity Charter is one example where we can again re-engage with the tech companies, like for instance, right now, I mean, just to for the information of everyone, remember Maria Ressa, the recent Nobel Prize awardee for journalism. I remember before she was the one who quote with Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook that you are using your platform as a weapon, you know, the same platform that we are trusting and same platform that we're using to provide information, the same platform being weaponized for false informations and for other rumors, things like that. So in the same manner, I think we need again to re-engage the private sector on this and sit together. As mentioned by Jim, I think we need again to come up with a more enabling environment to discuss the issue, because the COVID-19 was another wake-up call. As I said, in the midst of the COVID-19, we thought that all these platforms are game changers, but we have overestimated its capacity. At the end of the day, people are still wanted to be connected with people. So we need, you know, we need to set aside ourselves that at the end of the day, technology would always come second in terms of engagement. There's no way we can, you know, top that. So thanks for the heart, Fernanda. I'll stop here.
We've gone from sign language hearts to emoji hearts, which is an upgrade. I wanted to, not to keep highlighting you, Hill, but I sort of linked to that. I wanted to put you on the spot a little bit, because obviously you're working for UNICEF. UNICEF has its own platforms, your report being one of them. You know, these platforms that sort of have generated mixed results. But I am sort of wondering, you know, when we sort of try to put a new platform into a community, you know, as I say, mixed results, not all bad, not all good. What impact do you think that has on trust? Because we've sort of spoken a lot on technology. I know that, you know, Fernanda has been quite good at always bringing us back to the more sort of underlying issues of community engagement, but, you know, trust is obviously such a big one. And I'm just wondering, you know, in your experience, Hill, how you think technology sort of driven from the humanitarian perspective can sort of undermine that, or if there's any opportunities for it to also help. I don't know whether Hill's frozen on purpose or not, but I might also throw that one over to you, Fernanda, because I'm sure you've got something to say about it.
Tim, are you ready to jump in?
What do you think, Fernanda?
In terms of your report, or can we broaden a bit?
No, I think broadening it out, because we've scared Hill away. UNICEF has cut off his connection. But I just was sort of wondering about this link between technology and trust, and how you sort of see that play out in communities.
Uh-oh.
So it's a common, I think the UN is just like really tampering with the wires here.
Talk about UNICEF, but we'll see if my connection sticks.
Jim, as the last man standing, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, let me just give you an example. Oh my God, we really are dropping here. Hopefully, that
I know how to clear a room.
But I mean, UNICEF is our largest supporter of an effort to build shared platforms for the crisis response space around the world. People operate helplines of all kinds, and you know, we don't actually.
Sorry, I've lost connection. Sorry.
No worries.
I think I'll finish and then we'll get back to, and maybe we'll re-spotlight some of the other speakers. Like Hill and Fernanda seem to be back, so they need to be spotlighted alongside us. Anyway, I was just saying, you know, so the idea of UNICEF investing in platforms that are aimed at, you know, sort of national organizations that operate the national helplines is something that, you know, we've had really good experience with. And I think, you know, in a large part, UNICEF is funding us to upgrade the helplines from the telephone era to the social media era. I mean, in short, that's what we're working on. So, and I've actually been kind of delighted that UNICEF took more risks than I expected to actually fund this project, because they funded it before it was actually working. Which, you know, I'm used to having to rely on risk-taking donors from Silicon Valley for that. But anyway, but I think eventually we're going to have to build an interface to the UNICEF social case management system. I think that is in our future, probably.
I don't know, Hill, whether you ran away on purpose, but I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts on the link
No.
between sort of
Can you hear me
technology
now,
and trust. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. Can you hear me now? Hello?
We can hear you.
Sorry, Meg, yeah, sorry, I lost my connection. Your question, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
I mean, I guess an easier question is, how do you think that technology that is sort of being driven by large organizations plays out when it comes to the issue of trust in communities and trust in the humanitarian system? And is it sort of, can it help, or is it sort of a hindrance?
It's always a mixed result, to be honest. And it's always like, you know, the issue about, again, investing the time for people not only to appreciate it, but get used to it. And it goes back again, you know, to the usual problem about either we are trying to people to use it in the process, or we keep on just because there's a demand. You know, there's always a pressure of doing this. You know, I think there's always a challenge for big organizations that in every project or in every humanitarian response, you need to come up with something, you know, in the context of what we call innovative. You know, we're always, you know, not guilty, but there's always an obsession with that kind of context. So that's why there's always a mixed result in line with that. That's why it goes back again to you know, how are we adding value to the already existed, trusted, or preferred channel of the affected communities, rather than introducing a new one? Or if ever, are we doing it with the engagement of the community in such a way, you know, engage in they're the ones developing it with, you know, and the same in Indonesia and even in Nepal. It's more about because you're recognizing about, you know, people, you know, the marginalized sector, but more importantly is that because this system works. I'm talking about here, you know, years and years of experience of using that issue. And even up to now, for instance, and with the global pandemic, we wanted to maximize as much as online platforms. But it turns out, you know, that the people still, if you look at the top 3 choices,
Hill, I think we're losing you again. I'm sorry, but we did hear the critical point, which I think was, are we adding value?
The first choice.
I don't know, Murray, if we might need to mute Hill just because it's not working that well.
Meg, can I just add one line?
Hear me now? All right, there's my line is a bit.
I think I'll move to Fernanda.
Just one line. Trust is about listening and responding. We're listening, or we're discussing platforms to listen, and we're not responding. So we should at least balance our efforts, attention, discussions into listening and responding. Mm-hmm. Because we're breaking our trust by not responding.
Could not agree more. I've just, on that note, I've just got one last question, and I'll throw it back to you again, Fernanda. I think, so we've sort of discussed a lot of issues, but I'm wondering, you know, like many of these conversations, do we feel that this discussion is a little bit self-important? You know, given the sort of people that we are, and you know, the topics that we're discussing, And I guess what I mean by this is, you know, for how long do you think that we as humanitarian actors in a sort of somewhat traditional sense will be relevant as a critical player in a discussion like this? Fernanda, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we are going to lose relevancy. We already are in many ways when we come with, you briefly touched upon the supply and the demand. I totally agree with that. That resonates with me very much. So I think we need to adjust that, because or else we're going to become more and more irrelevant. And that might have a positive side to it, but depending to what crisis, right? We cannot, you know, there's certain contexts that can provoke looking for their own solutions. But there are other contexts that people are dying because they don't have any food, you know? So yeah, there's no one answer. There's no one answer, but relevancy, I think we are already losing a bit of relevancy in general. Unfortunately, we have to reinvent ourselves.
We were going to wrap up with a poll, but I wanted to make an example of myself, to Jim's point, and sort of demonstrate that humanitarians don't know how to leverage technology. So we're not going to do that because I can't make it work. But it would be great to hear just one final thought from each of you. So maybe I'll start with you, Jim.
Well, I know we only touched briefly on data colonialism, but I find it very ironic that, especially I come out of the social innovation field, right? We're all about community empowerment. And then you look how we handle the data of communities, and it's completely colonial and extractive, right? We're going to measure results, and we're going to make you accountable for them, and we're going to punish you with the data. And wow, I mean, so I think that, you know, if you actually believe that our goal is to make communities healthy, to actually serve people, I think we have a lot of interest in sharing the information that we collect. I mean, not personally identifiable information, you know, the ethical sharing of this critical information, and trusting communities with the information and individuals with the information they need to make better decisions for themselves and their families, right? I think as a technologist, you know, data is the new gold, blah, blah, blah. But right now we have a very extractive model of using data in a way that actually hurts people in many cases. It helps people in a lot of other cases. So as we are all approaching our program designs and how we're going to use data, I think we have to think about how do we share power? And part of sharing power is trusting people with data about their place, their community, the resources that are available to them, what their peers are saying. Those are all critically important, because that's how human beings actually do things. So we actually want to shift more of that power, and part of that is shifting sort of this information and in the public interest rather than solely the private sort of extractive interest of how can I monetize this community.
A lot of rich thoughts there in a very short intervention. Thank you so much. Hill, have we got you back for one final thought? I'm guessing no, so I'll throw over to Fernanda.
Okay, so evolution is needed so we can reach revolution. And when I'm talking about evolution, I'm talking about inner revolution. So community empowerment, revolution within the system. And what gives me hope is new leadership. We need new leadership in order to take this forward. And we also need to heal our own humanity.
Thank you so much, both of you, and to Hill, obviously, also. It's interesting, I've been taking a lot of notes as I've been talking and listening, and most of them actually don't have anything to do with technology at all, but sort of allude to the more deep issues that underpin the humanitarian system. You know, this need for humanitarians to let go, to not be so ego-driven, the fact that we don't listen, we're scared of risk, we're paternalistic, colonial, we don't play nicely together in the sandpit. You know, there's this need for the collective and for sharing a bit more. people on the good side sort of need to become more powerful, but that's not always possible. We don't understand safety and protection always, but still apply this very paternalistic lens. We sometimes ignore the obvious. And we forget sometimes this great point that Hill made about how human connections are always going to come first and that technology is always going to, come second. This idea that we're colonial and extractive, I think is still definitely a problem. And also this sort of overarching need to listen better and respond. And if that was a principle that was applied more broadly across the sector, but for sure with regard to how we use technology, I think we'd go a long way. So I just wanted to say, with that, we'll wrap up. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but thank you so much to Fernanda and Hill and Jim for a very, very rich discussion. I obviously didn't know this morning that I was going to be here, but it's been so nice and I've learned a lot. And a huge thank you to CDAC for putting on such an interesting discussion and for having me, and also to ALNAP for hosting this very well-run event. So I'm not sure whether CDAC wanted to say anything to close, but just a big thank you from me.
Thank you so much to everybody for a fantastic event. I won't repeat the thank yous. We look forward to the next one and expanding this discussion beyond today's. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening, morning, night.